A couple hours from now, Trump will deliver his immigration speech. A Trump staffer anonymously told NBC News about his plans. This is what he said. Trump will likely call for stricter worksite enforcement, more extensive tracking of visa overstays, mandatory use of E-Verify by employers to weed out illegal workers. He would also endorse cracking down on sanctuary cities where local authorities are ordered not to involve themselves in federal immigration matters. A little different than what he had said before, but nonetheless, he's the get tough on immigrant candidate. Let's bring in our panel right now and get their take. Immigration attorney Chris Cabanillas joins us, as does Amy Dardashian, attorney, legal analyst, Emmy award-winning journalist. How about you guys saying that? Mark Furnish, adjunct professor at the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University. Professor, he's also argued before the U.S. Supreme Court and argued with just about everyone on the planet. Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLC. He's also former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. Gentlemen, lady, thank you very much. Chris, I'm going to start with you. Who knows what he's going to say? But if the Trump of the first 14 months, his whole position, as we said before, was we're building a wall, they're paying for it, and all the 11 million or whatever the number is of illegal immigrants, we're going to round them up and we're going to force them to go back to their country, and they're going to get in line like everybody else. Legally, forget about ethically, morally, practically, legally, what are the issues with that, saying even that he could get his policy through Congress?
Well, I think legally, certainly if he's the commander-in-chief, he has the ability, right, to enforce those laws. And technically on the books, lots of those laws say that that can be done. Now, there are ways around that. People can file applications and waivers and seek stays of that from happening. But again, it's tough to separate what, practically speaking, can happen versus what technically can happen.
I've heard some of the concerns where if he were able to enact at least what he's been campaigning on as policy, you would have actually certain legal members of families that would be deported as well, that you would also break up families. Children would be sent back. How much of that's hyperbole and how much of that is real?
Well, I'll tell you, that certainly would be real. I mean, there's a lot of situations where, obviously if you're born here, you're a citizen, and people's parents might have come, undocumented, and they're here without status. As a result, they could run the risk of being deported. And a lot of people are afraid of that. I have a lot of clients right now that are really worried that, there's a lot of rah-rah behind the rhetoric of, Trump's taking a stand, and he's doing the right thing, and it's got a lot of people fired up behind him, and people are feeling that, and people are scared.
One of the aspects that I assume he's going to talk about, and there'll be optics with it, he'll bring families, or I'll have them in the backdrop that he'll acknowledge, that have lost loved ones to violent crimes at the hands of an illegal immigrant. Certainly made national headlines. We talked about this program in certain sanctuary cities, San Francisco most notably, where an illegal immigrant that was here that had a criminal record was not deported, and he took the life in a horrific way of a law-abiding citizen who just happened to be in his ambit. How much, though, of sanctuary cities, and I'll start with you, Mark, is really federal policy versus cities making their own policies as to how they choose to enforce this?
A city can't override federal law. I mean, that's basic, that's basic constitutional principles, the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. It falls to Congress and Congress alone to set national immigration policies. And in fact, the Constitution prohibits states from extending citizenship and doing things like that on their own. As it happens, I just took a look at it today. So they can't.
But it wasn't about establishing citizenship depending on jurisdictions. It was their choice of enforcement when prosecuting a crime, and then the next step beyond just saying, here's your punishment, here's your fine, here's whatever else. Now all of a sudden we're going to ask as ICE or an immigration officer.
It's laxity of enforcement on both the federal and the state end. I mean, it's very easy to turn a convicted criminal over to the feds. In every case that I've ever been in, and my primary area of practice is criminal defense, I mean, if it looks like the person is not a citizen, the first question you ask are you a citizen? Because the deportation, or as we call it, removal consequences of the conviction could be worse than any minimal term of imprisonment they might incur.
I would say that it's not just laxity at the local level. What it is active obstruction. I mean, that's what these sanctuary cities represent. They say we are not going to cooperate with customs and immigration enforcement. And to me, it's amazing that one of these sanctuary cities exists, let alone 300, because we're not talking about illegal immigrants that are law-abiding. I know that sounds, like an oxymoron, but we're talking about illegal immigrants that are, in many cases, violent felons and repeat offenders. Why would anybody want to obstruct federal immigration from deporting those people?
Let's let Chris jump in here and respond.
Well, look, I think that, in theory, certainly nobody would be in support of that. I think the realities are, though, that it's such a big issue. There's not enough enforcement officers to sort of enforce all this. So how do you do it? Do you pick and choose by the look of somebody who you're going to enforce that against, or do you, how do you practically
it's when somebody commits a crime, ICE reaches out and says, detain this person. We are ordering you to detain them, and they even have priority enforcement. So they're not doing that with people who are like busted on small, little misdemeanors. We're talking about people who are repeat offenders, people who are violent criminals, who pose a risk to the health and safety of the public, and they're saying detain these people, and you have sanctuary city officials who are actively obstructing and purposefully, which is what happened with Catherine Steinle, purposefully releasing people back out into the public, and they're committing more crimes. It's beyond me why this is going on.
The laxity is on the federal end, and that's what Trump is talking about putting a stop to. The feds could stop that in 3 seconds flat, partially by the power of the purse. We've talked about on this show repeatedly how the state and local governments share in federal forfeiture monies. They get tons of subsidies for law enforcement purposes. All they have to do is withhold that in order to get them to enforce ICE policy.
Well, Mayo, you worked in a DA's office. Practically, Trump's big thing is, I'll just deport the criminals, okay? If he goes that route. Law in the books right now says that's what's supposed to happen. Practically, can they do that? Or now are they wearing a separate hat? They're not just cops, but they're also immigration? Or do they just say, we don't have to do anything, we'll just let ICE know and ICE will pick it up?
Well, what happens is now, following Padilla v. Kentucky, what's happened is that every single time you take a plea, you are asked, have you been advised of your immigration consequences that may occur if you're not a citizen? Some judges actually ask the person, are you a citizen? And the person will answer no on the record. If they're sentenced to probation, probation knows they're not a citizen. And what we've had happen in the past is people have gone through sometimes 2 years out of 3 or 4 years out of 5 years of probation, and they've done so very well, and then they end up getting a visit from ICE at the probation office where they get deported. But the other thing that happens is you can get a tour of the United States. So you may be held, let's say for petty larceny, you didn't pay for your coffee. You may go all around the United States to different detention centers, which goes back to our pay for play, and are you getting some of these maybe private detention centers where you see St. Louis, you're now in New Jersey, then you go somewhere else instead of actually being deported. I've had a number of clients who've had that happen.
Right, and now they have to get the bail hearing after 6 months.
Just released a study that said in 2014 to 2015, 17,000 detainer notices were ignored by sanctuary cities, and 70% of those were people with prior criminal histories. So those numbers are just, they flabbergast me.
But again, if the feds are aware of these people, it's not up to the city itself. The city doesn't even have the ability to deport. So the city may say we're not enforcing certain rules, like New York City says they're not going to criminalize marijuana.
Right.
Well, but they may be held, and if they're not held in detention, they are on probation quite often, or there's a record as to where they reside. So the federal government has the resources to go out and to enforce the laws against those people.
They should be more aggressive about finding
if you go to Colorado and Washington, the federal law against legal marijuana, that's not exactly enforced either. I'm not saying it's an equatable thing, but
priority enforcement. I mean, you're not talking about going and ripping a mother away from her child who's hardworking and just got here illegally.
So, Chris, just because I'm up on it for time, your take tonight, what are you going to listen most closely from what Trump says on the stump? Well,
again, it's a question of how much is he going to waver from his previous hardline decisions. I mean, I think that, before to really sort of rally the troops and get through the primaries, he had to really, really go right and really go conservative with it. Is he going to stay there, or is he going to try to soften it up a bit? So I'm curious to see how he's going to, react with that.
As am I. All right, everyone. Coming up next, kids in crisis. By now, you've probably seen this video of a guy, not even a parent, tossing the 4-year-old off the bridge with his mother cheering in the background. Question is, where is the line when the law steps in and parents have to step aside?